Have you ever witnessed something so unexpected, so wildly out of place in the world you thought you understood, that for a moment you questioned everything about human nature? What if I told you that somewhere inside a quiet European hospital, a billionaire, one of Germany's most private, most calculating tycoons, once stood absolutely frozen, not by the sight of a medical machine, not by a diagnosis, but by a single conversation with a Filipino nurse? And what if I told you that this man, who could purchase yachts the way most people buy groceries, suddenly declared that he wanted to buy the entire hospital just to keep one Filipino nurse from being reassigned? It sounds exaggerated, almost impossible, as if the whole world had long agreed that billionaires are too rational, too cold, too data-driven to make emotional decisions. We imagine them as men who measure life in profit margins, men who don't cry, men who never cling to strangers. But there he was, Karl Brenner, a name whispered in European business circles with a mix of fear and respect, standing beside a hospital bed with his voice trembling for the first time in decades. People in the hospital didn't understand it at first. They knew he was a powerful industrialist, a man with influence that stretched across shipping, renewable energy, pharmaceuticals. They knew he rarely spoke to anyone outside his boardrooms. And yet, that day, something stopped him. Something softened him. Something broke him in ways he could not explain. And that something was Maria Santos, a nurse from Batangas, small in stature but unshakable in presence. The kind of woman whose smile carried both gentleness and quiet authority. She wasn't the head nurse. She wasn't the most senior. She wasn't even assigned permanently to Brenner's floor. But when she stood beside his dying wife, when she whispered a prayer in a language he did not understand, something in him shifted, almost like a crack forming in the armor he had spent his entire life building. Maria didn't even know who he was the first time she cared for his wife. She only saw a woman in pain, a husband trying to hide the fear in his eyes, and a family losing its grip on hope. She moved with that calm, deeply Filipino grace. Steady, reverent, almost spiritual. And there was a moment, Karl would later recall, when he felt as if the room itself changed. As if the weight of the world lifted, even for a second. That was the beginning of a story he never planned to tell, a story few believed when they first heard it. But you're here, listening, and perhaps something in you already senses that this is not just about wealth or illness or a nurse doing her job. This is about a man discovering something he had never seen before. And this is where Maria enters Karl's life. Not as an employee, not as a nurse, but as the first person who made him feel that compassion still existed in a world he thought had gone cold. Karl Brenner wasn't always the untouchable mogul people imagined. Long before he stood in that quiet German hospital room, he had survived his own storms, illnesses untreated during his childhood, hunger during the harshest winters, the collapse of his father's small factory, the silent war inside his home when hope seemed like an unreachable luxury. He carried all of that with him into adulthood, turning pain into discipline, discipline into success, and success into a fortress that kept everyone at arm's length. Then came the diagnosis. Not for him, but for Annalise, his wife of 30 years, the only person who had ever seen past his armor. A rare autoimmune condition that no doctor in Munich, Berlin, or even Zurich could fully explain. They flew across Europe, Vienna, Stockholm, London, the brightest specialists. The most advanced technology, endless tests, endless consultations, endless promises that turned to apologies. With each failed attempt to stabilize her condition, Karl felt something inside him grow heavier. He wasn't used to losing. He wasn't used to helplessness. But this illness didn't care about money. It didn't respond to influence. It didn't negotiate. And so he traveled farther. The United States, Japan, high-end clinics in Singapore, experimental therapies in Switzerland. Each door that closed pushed him deeper into a quiet desperation that no one around him dared to acknowledge. He became a shadow in his own life, moving, deciding, signing papers, but no longer living. Then came the moment that changed everything, though he didn't recognize it at the time. A Filipino doctor in Hamburg gently suggested a palliative specialist from the Philippines who had recently joined the hospital rotation. "She is different," the doctor said softly. "You will see." Filipinos had crossed Carl's path before. Caregivers for aging executives, nurses in the clinics he visited, workers in the ports that his ships passed through. He never paid attention. The world spoke about them as if they were one of the globe's quiet workforces, reliable, kind, invisible. He never questioned it. But that night, when the Filipino doctor spoke of compassion, something in Carl shifted. Not hope. He was too tired for hope. But perhaps curiosity. A faint whisper that maybe, somewhere, somehow, someone existed who could ease the weight he carried. When Maria finally stepped into the room, he only noticed her presence because the air seemed to soften. It was such a simple thing, almost unremarkable. A light knock, a gentle greeting, a hint of a prayer under her breath. And yet it felt different from every nurse, every doctor, every specialist who had come before. He didn't know it then, but the Philippines, through one nurse, was about to enter his life in a way he never imagined possible. In the days that followed, something quietly transformative happened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't medical. It wasn't even visible to the hospital staff who saw hundreds of patients every week. But to Carl, it was unmistakable. Whenever Maria entered the room, his wife's breathing seemed to ease. Whenever she whispered a prayer, even in Tagalog, a language unfamiliar to them, the tension in the air dissolved. Whenever she held Annalise's hand, Carl saw a glimpse of something he had not seen in months. Peace. There was one evening he would never forget. The machines were beeping faster. The doctors had stepped out to discuss another change in medication. The winter snow was whipping against the windows like white knives. And in the middle of that cold, metallic room, Maria simply hummed a hymn. Soft, trembling, sacred. It wasn't a melody Carl knew, yet it carried the familiar warmth of faith he had long abandoned. He found himself leaning against the wall, listening, breathing slowly for the first time in days. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked when she finished. She smiled, almost shyly. "From home, sir. We sing it in Batangas when someone needs comfort." That single sentence opened a door Carl didn't expect. Home. Comfort. Words that had become foreign to him. Words he no longer used. He began asking her about the Philippines, not out of politeness, but out of an unfamiliar desire to understand the person who seemed to steady the storm inside him. She spoke of her town, the smell of the sea at dawn, her mother's prayers during the novena, the laughter of children running through the streets even during typhoons. She spoke of hardship, but also of joy, the kind Westerners struggled to understand. Joy that wasn't purchased or planned, joy that simply existed. Carl found himself listening more than speaking, and in those moments he felt something inside him soften, something he didn't know was still alive. It wasn't long before the other nurses noticed that Carl waited for Maria's shifts. He timed his questions around her schedule. He became less irritable, less distant. And his wife, though still gravely ill, seemed to find moments of serenity whenever Maria was near. Germany had failed them. Europe had exhausted them. The West, with all its technology and expertise, could not offer what one Filipino nurse offered without trying. Compassion wrapped in humility, faith wrapped in gentleness, healing wrapped in humanity. Carl didn't say it aloud, but for the first time, a new thought entered his mind. A thought he would later confess felt almost like a revelation. Perhaps the answer he had been searching for was never in the West at all. Carl began spending more time in the hospital than he did in his own home. Not because the doctors demanded it, but because he found himself drawn to Maria's presence, like a man who had wandered too long in darkness and suddenly found a light. He observed everything, how she greeted every patient by name, how she remembered the smallest details, how she whispered prayers not as a ritual, but as an instinct. There was a day he saw her slip a blanket over an elderly patient's feet, saying gently, "Para hindi kayo ginawin?" Even without understanding the words, Carl felt the tenderness in them. He watched how she laughed softly with the cleaning staff, how she encouraged a young nurse struggling with her first week, how she offered her lunch to a patient's son who had not eaten since morning. These weren't grand gestures. They were everyday miracles, the kind that rebuild a man's faith piece by fragile piece. Carl found himself changing. The man who once negotiated billion-euro deals without blinking now sat quietly beside his wife, holding her hand the way Maria had taught him. The man who believed emotions were distractions now felt his throat tighten whenever Maria prayed. There was one moment, the moment that became the soul of this entire story. Annalise had slipped into a deeper, quieter state. The doctors warned that her time was near. Carl stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. And that was when Maria stepped closer, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said the words no one had ever spoken to him with such sincerity. "It's okay to let love speak louder than fear." He broke, not loudly, not dramatically. A single tear, then another. A billionaire crying not for loss, but for the sudden understanding that he had spent most of his life in fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of failure, fear of not being enough to protect the woman he loved. And in that moment, he felt something shift irrevocably inside him. After Annalise passed peacefully, with Maria humming the same hymn from Batangas, the hospital prepared to reassign staff. It was normal protocol, nothing personal. But to Carl, it felt like losing the last piece of light he had left. So he made the most irrational, most emotional, most profoundly human decision of his life. He approached the hospital director and said in a voice unshakably firm, "I want to buy this hospital." The director stared at him, confused. "Mr. Brenner, may I ask why?" Carl looked at Maria, who was comforting another patient just a few feet away. "So she never has to leave." Of course, he didn't buy the hospital. The board would never have allowed such a transaction. But what mattered was the intent. For a man who once valued assets over emotion, the thought alone revealed how profoundly he had changed. When the board refused, Carl didn't argue. He simply insisted, that he fund a new palliative wing under his wife's name. Not a cold, sterile wing, but one designed around compassion, warmth, and dignity. And at the center of it, he ensured one thing: Maria would lead the nursing team. For the first time in her career, Maria felt seen not just as a worker, not as an immigrant, but as a healer whose kindness had altered the life of a man the world believed was unchangeable. Years later, Carl would tell his board of directors, "The greatest lesson of my life did not come from a university or a business partner. It came from a Filipino nurse who showed me what humanity looks like." He traveled to the Philippines eventually, not as a businessman, but as a pilgrim seeking the origin of the compassion that saved him. He visited Batangas, walked through Maria's childhood church, listened to the same hymns she once hummed, and for the first time since he was a boy, he knelt and prayed. He later said that the Philippines didn't just reopen his faith, it rebuilt it. And in the years that followed, he supported scholarships for Filipino nurses, medical missions in Visayas and Mindanao, and health programs in remote areas, not out of charity, but out of gratitude. Because the truth he discovered was simple yet profound. In a world that often forgets what compassion looks like, the Philippines has not forgotten. Filipinos carry a kind of mercy that does not fade under pressure, a resilience that does not bend under hardship, a faith that does not break even under suffering. They serve not because they must, but because it is embedded in their spirit. Carl's story became a quiet reminder to those willing to listen, that the world still needs the Filipino heart, that greatness isn't always loud, that kindness can reshape even the most powerful lives. And to every Filipino watching, this story is not just about Maria. It is about you, your culture, your faith, your warmth, your resilience. You are seen. You are valued. You are admired more deeply than you know. Because somewhere in Germany, a billionaire found something he never found anywhere else: hope, humanity, and a reminder that the greatest healers in the world often come from the islands where compassion is born with the sunrise.